January 23rd, 2014. The phone rings at the Napa Police Department. It is Robin Slusher, a grandmother desperate for eyes on her 3-year-old granddaughter. She detailed a volatile situation to dispatch, describing a custodial arrangement that was rapidly deteriorating. The mother was spiraling into instability with an unidentified man, and 60 days had passed since Robin last saw the little girl. Authorities issued a standard promise. A patrol unit would be dispatched to investigate. The officer arrived, knocked, and conducted a brief doorstep interview with the mother before clearing the scene. He never actually confirmed the child's presence. He remained oblivious to the predator lurking inside that apartment, a man with an active arrest warrant already in the database. One basic background query could have rewritten the entire narrative. But within 7 days, the situation would reach a point of no return. This was hardly the only missed opportunity to intervene in the case of Kaye Slusher. In the final 21 days, law enforcement and social workers had 6 distinct points of contact with that residence. 6 times, officials stood at the very threshold where a child was being flagged for welfare. 6 times, they simply turned around and walked away. This is the investigation of a total systemic collapse, a safety net that failed every psychological and procedural test. But before we dissect those final weeks, you need to understand the soul of the girl at the center of this file. Without that perspective, it is impossible to grasp the gravity of the silence that fell on January 30th, 2014. Before I open this case file, I am asking for your direct assistance in this mission. Please engage with this report by liking, subscribing, and sharing it. Leave a comment with your current location and time. Why does this matter? Because every narrative here represents the final testimony of a child who was silenced. It is a lesson in recognizing red flags before the trail goes cold. Each time we disseminate this intelligence, more people learn to identify the lethal patterns and stop these outcomes. We act as the voice for those who can no longer speak. You are now an essential part of this investigative mission. May 3rd, 2010. In Napa, California, a region known for tranquil vineyards, a baby girl was born. Her name was Kaye Jane Slusher. When grandmother Robin first held her in that hospital room, she felt that primal, protective instinct, a boundless devotion to this tiny life. Kaye was the long-awaited light of the family. That afternoon, Robin and her husband Benny made a silent pact. They would do whatever was necessary to ensure her safety. They could not yet perceive the crushing weight of that promise, or the price they would pay while trying to uphold it. Kaye matured into the kind of child who naturally radiated joy, impacting every life she brushed against. She possessed a rare psychological gift, the ability to disarm the most guarded hearts with a single, genuine smile. Neighbors at the Royal Garden Apartments became accustomed to her cheerful presence whenever she occupied the local playground. Cashiers at the nearby market always softened when they saw those brown eyes shimmering with a pure, unadulterated happiness. She approached every adult with total confidence, unaware that some figures do not deserve the luxury of a child's trust. This profound openness was her greatest character trait. But as the investigation shows, it was also her fatal vulnerability. Among her childhood fixations, Kaye was most devoted to the story of Princess Sophia, an ordinary girl who ascended to royalty while maintaining her sense of kindness and justice. Robin kept her in colorful dresses, and Kaye would spin before the mirror, lost in a kingdom where she was safe and cherished. In those moments, her hazel eyes, streaked with flecks of green, were vibrant windows into a world of pure potential. She was the protagonist of her own fairy tale, oblivious to the darkness gathering just outside her sanctuary. Burn these details into your memory: the hazel green eyes, the princess stories, and those bright dresses. Later, their significance will become haunting. Her grandparents' house was the only true home she knew. There, she had the essential requirements: nourishment, security, and a love that was entirely unconditional. Robin and Benny Slusher were forced into a role that should never have been theirs to fill. They became the functional parents, compensating for the fundamental failures of the biological mother. They subsidized the apartment and managed the bills to keep a roof over her head. They provided the material needs, but the emotional investment was the real currency. They gave her their entire world. Every visit was a celebration of cookies and park walks, but every departure left a hollow ache in Robin's chest. She lived with a persistent, gnawing dread every time she had to return the girl to her mother's custody. To understand the tragedy of Kaye Slusher, we must examine the individuals who were sworn to protect her and why they failed. 23-year-old Sarah Kruger carried a heavy psychological profile long before her daughter was ever born. Her existence was defined by internal instability and fractured relationships that left permanent emotional trauma. At Kaye's birth, many hoped motherhood would provide the leverage needed for Sarah to finally stabilize. For a brief window, the data suggested she was finally trending toward recovery, but toxic patterns rarely vanish. They merely retreat, awaiting a moment of weakness to resurface. The father, Jason Slusher, possessed a criminal record that shadowed his entire adult history. Yet, one anomaly existed: a profound attachment to his child that seemed to override his impulses. He viewed her as his sole redemptive element. Later, behind bars, he offered a haunting statement. Kaye represented the only objective success in a lifetime of total failures. The singular light in a darkness he manufactured. Despite his flaws, Slusher's devotion was genuine. While he remained present, Sarah stayed under control, aware that an observer was always watching. The child was secure for now, but the household's structural integrity rested on one precarious pillar. On September 30th, 2013, the state removed that pillar, sentencing Slusher to 3 years. He had led authorities on a high-speed pursuit, jeopardizing civilians, and now faced the consequences. By October 10th, he was processed into San Quentin, vanishing just as his daughter's vulnerability peaked. He didn't know this was final. His arrest created a vacuum, soon filled by unpredictable forces. With her primary restraint gone, Sarah's psychological descent was immediate and devastating. We must examine critical evidence before proceeding further with the timeline. Within Kaye's case file, there is a secondary subject I have not yet disclosed. He entered Sarah's orbit during her peak vulnerability. A man named Ryan Scott Warner, 26 years old, with a violent background that would immediately trigger red flags for investigators. His dossier remains classified for now. You will soon see this was a systemic catastrophe. Within weeks of the incarceration, the grandmother, Robin, documented sharp shifts in the suspect's behavior. Verbal communication became sparse, replaced by a tone fluctuating between overt hostility and deep paranoia. Robin initially dismissed these warning flags as stress. A single mother with an incarcerated partner. The situational stressors provided a logical, misleading explanation. Her life had collapsed, but the justifications for isolation soon became transparently fabricated and absurd. Constant deflections turned into total radio silence. The subject eventually ceased all outgoing communications. Thanksgiving 2013 was the final visual confirmation of the victim, now etched in memory. The child's physical and behavioral presentation had undergone a disturbing, unrecognizable metamorphosis. She exhibited extreme hypervigilance, constantly scanning the room as if anticipating an imminent threat. Yet, upon seeing Robin, those distinct hazel green eyes momentarily regained their lost luminosity and joy. She sought immediate physical refuge, clinging to her grandmother with a desperate, crushing intensity. Feeling the child's racing heart, Robin experienced a profound sense of intuitive maternal dread. She was unaware this contact was terminal, the last time she'd hold that fragile light. Following that encounter, Sarah initiated a total blackout, severing all digital and personal ties. Locked doors and silence followed, despite Robin's exhaustive attempts to re-establish contact through every channel. She couldn't rationalize why the suspect had moved to completely alienate the child from her family. What was happening inside? Why had the girl vanished from the local playgrounds entirely? Why were neighbors reporting suspicious nocturnal disturbances and loud impacts emanating from the unit? Robin lacked proof, but her intuition signaled a deep-seated wrongness festering behind those dead-bolted doors. Now, we unseal the file on Ryan Warner and analyze the systemic failure of this case. This is a prosecution of negligence. Had officers simply verified the male occupant's identity, the law enforcement database would have triggered an immediate, high-priority alarm for the responding team. The subject had an extensive history of violent interactions with the justice system. An active warrant was live, mandating that law enforcement take him into immediate custody. Most damning was the active restraining order, a legal red flag stemming from his history of domestic aggression. The database had him flagged, yet this high-risk subject was now cohabitating with 3-year-old Kaye. The Royal Garden unit devolved into a toxic vacuum where Sarah and Warner spiraled into a pattern of total instability. It erodes the psyche, shifts every priority, and kills the basic human instinct to protect a child. Neighbors began reporting unprecedented auditory red flags leaking from that specific unit. High-decibel midnight confrontations. The unmistakable acoustics of a household in total disarray. Tactical warnings began emanating from the apartment, the kind that should trigger an immediate police response. Inside, a 3-year-old girl who once played princess in the mirror sat trapped in the shadows. Kaylee vanished from the local playground, her daily outdoor routine abruptly terminated. The waves to neighbors stopped. The laughter died. The cheerful greetings to strangers were silenced. A child's innate trust had been conditioned into a strategic, fearful, and total silence. She became a ghost, isolated from any possible intervention. The visual was blocked, but the audio told a story. The complex residents did not stay quiet. They documented the verbal combat and the recurring disputes. They observed high-frequency, suspicious foot traffic at all hours, and recognized the escalating danger. They flooded dispatch with calls. Over 18 months, Napa police logged 14 separate distress reports for that address. 14 distinct attempts to force the authorities to look at what was happening behind that door. 14 service requests that the system bureaucratically dismissed as low-level disturbances. Noise calls, loitering, and domestic spats were logged as trivialities, deemed unworthy of real investigative scrutiny. Blocked by a total communications blackout, grandmother Robin initiated her own desperate search for the truth. Every waking and sleeping thought was Kaye. She harassed every agency, police, social services, and crisis hotlines. She detailed every metric of the household's volatility to anyone who would listen. She reported the unidentified male on site and her lack of visual confirmation on the child for months. Trembling with panic, she begged every dispatcher and caseworker to conduct a physical welfare check. Robin trusted the protective net to catch her granddaughter. She was tragically mistaken. January 2014. The tipping point. These facts are pulled directly from sworn documented court testimony. In the final 3-week window of this high-risk investigation, law enforcement and social workers made 6 physical contacts at that specific residence, 6 boots-on-the-ground opportunities to assess a child in danger, 6 failures to recognize the threat, 6 pivot points where the outcome could have shifted. 6 times they simply walked back to their cruisers. Let's break down those missed interceptions. This is how systemic apathy fails the most vulnerable. January 23, 2014. Robin makes a decisive move. Driven by 2 months of total isolation and a grandmother's dark, persistent intuition, she forced a formal welfare request through the Napa Police Department dispatch. She provided high-granularity intel. Kaye Slusher, age 3, residing in a volatile environment with an unstable mother. She flagged an unvetted male subject with a concerning profile living inside the apartment. The grandmother cited a prolonged denial of access and grave concerns for the subject's physical safety. Call logged. Dispatch sent Officer Garrett Wade to the scene to investigate. His subsequent negligence would spark a multi-million-dollar federal suit and rewrite California's police protocols. Wade arrived on location and approached the target building. He initiated contact at the door. The primary suspect, Sarah Kruger, answered. She blocked the entryway, dismissing the grandmother's formal complaint as a hysterical fabrication. Wade caught a glimpse of a male figure and a meal on the table. He cleared the call and left. Officer Wade failed to identify the male subject or ask for a name. No database query. No physical confirmation of the child's status. He just turned and walked away. Take a moment to process the gravity of this situation. Had he executed a standard inquiry, just a few keystrokes for the name Ryan Warner, the system would have flagged an active arrest warrant. Protocol would have dictated an immediate custodial arrest. The child protective apparatus would have been triggered automatically. Kaye might have slept in her grandmother's arms that night, instead of that apartment. 60 seconds and a single correct choice could have rewritten her entire fate. But Officer Wade bypassed the procedure. He didn't just fail his duty, he committed a far more sinister oversight. He fed the grandmother a false sense of security, calling Robin with assurances that would eventually taste like ash. Status is green. Do not worry. I am maintaining surveillance on the residence. He filed no official report, logged no intelligence, and failed to refer the case to the social welfare grid. Robin placed her faith in the badge, trusting that an officer of the law was incapable of such deception. She was blind to the fact that he hadn't even confirmed the child's presence, clearing the scene without an ounce of verification. His vow of vigilance was a hollow lie. The first window for intervention slammed shut. 4 days of agonizing silence followed. Police platitudes couldn't silence Robin's internal alarm. A primal instinct told her the girl was drowning in danger. On January 27th, she reached out to Napa County Social Services. She knew the administrative reach of a social worker could bypass the barriers the police had refused to cross. She spoke with an agent named Rosio Diaz-Lara and unloaded the full weight of her suspicions. The hazardous environment, the presence of a high-risk male subject, and the total isolation of a vulnerable child. Diaz-Lara documented the intake and pledged a review. But we must analyze the legal landscape of California here. Any agent receiving reports of child endangerment is legally mandated to cross-report to law enforcement and the district attorney immediately. This is not a guideline or a professional courtesy. It is a strict directive. It is a statutory obligation. A breach of this duty is a prosecutable criminal offense. Rosio Diaz-Lara bypassed the statute entirely, burying the report in her own files. Even more egregious, her superior, Ken Adams, authorized the case to be shuttered without a single investigative step. No physical welfare check, no visual confirmation, total institutional silence regarding a red flag child. This tactical failure created a vacuum of intelligence that would lead to a total disaster. Social services held the risk profile. The police held the physical response. Neither side communicated, leaving both blind to the escalating threat. The departments operated in silos, failing to synthesize a complete picture from the fragmented data points. And at the center of this bureaucratic chaos, concealed within the shadows of a decaying residence, a 3-year-old girl was enduring her final days of survival. The second opportunity for rescue evaporated. As January neared its grim conclusion, patrol units returned to the Royal Garden complex twice, dispatched for reports of localized disturbances and erratic behavior. Officers Robert Chambers and Garrett Smith managed to breach the threshold and gain entry. They witnessed the squalor firsthand, observing adults who were clearly unfit for the responsibilities of caretaking. And there stood Kaye, a small, breathing soul staring back at them. The light in her gaze was already beginning to flicker out. This was the final intersection where a detour from tragedy was possible. Forensic timelines would later confirm the stakes. By this juncture, the physiological indicators of severe neglect were already screaming for attention. The specifics of her condition at that moment are too harrowing to vocalize. Regulatory constraints prevent me from detailing the investigative findings, but the reality was undeniable. The red flags were staring them in the face. They were ignored. Chambers filed a retrospective report, essentially a defensive document to justify their failure to act. A single sentence in that file would become the centerpiece of the federal negligence case. He wrote, "Subject appeared healthy. Subject has blue eyes." But recall the profile. Her eyes were hazel with streaks of green, not blue. This discrepancy suggests a cold reality. He either never looked her in the face, or his assessment was so shallow that he missed both her identity and the blatant signs of a child in crisis. The third and fourth windows of salvation slammed shut for good. Under 7 days remained on the clock. During those final moments before the case reached its grim finale, 2 more desperate tips hit the emergency switchboard. These weren't casual observers. They were people who refused to accept silence, begging for someone in a badge to finally listen. First responders arrived, performed a cursory knock and talk, and traded a few empty words with the adults at the entrance. Each time, they walked away content with surface-level lies, leaning on the flawed paperwork left by the officers who came before them. Their logic was simple. Since no one found anything yesterday, nothing must be wrong today. It was a fatal assumption. Every officer assumed the heavy lifting was already done. It is a textbook psychological failure, a total breakdown of what we call the diffusion of responsibility. In this broken machine, every single participant believes the burden of action lies on a different shoulder. Law enforcement sat back, waiting for social services to take the lead, while those caseworkers were busy relying on sanitized police logs. The gears of the bureaucracy turned without grinding anything. Files shifted across desks, and every checkmark was placed exactly where the protocol demanded. On a clipboard, the situation looked resolved, but the reality behind that locked apartment door was a descent into pure darkness. 3-year-old Kaye was entering her final documented chapter in that hellhole. Every last safety net, the 5th, the 6th, had been shredded. I won't detail the specifics of what Kaye endured during those final 72 hours of her life. It isn't for a lack of intel. It is because the harrowing findings documented by the medical examiners exceed the boundaries of what these platform guidelines permit. The brutal truth is archived in public court transcripts for anyone with the stomach to investigate the full gravity of the situation. Here is what I can disclose. The environment had deteriorated into a code red state where immediate tactical intervention was the only hope. Forensic specialists later testified that a single phone call, even during those dying hours, would have changed the entire trajectory. A different ending was possible. The hospital was ready. The medicine existed. Time had not yet run out, but the phone remained silent. Sarah Kruger and Ryan Warner never dialed 911. They never flagged down a cruiser or reached out for help. Silence was their chosen weapon, fueled by the cold knowledge that any inquiry would expose their true nature to the world. They chose their own freedom over a toddler's life. Consequently, on January 30th, 2014, at 1 p.m., Kaye Slusher's story reached its end. She was exactly 3 years and 8 months old. 44 months of a life that began with a blank slate of potential, only to end in a nightmare that was entirely preventable. She entered the world in a scenic wine country city, only to perish in a rotting apartment defined by chaos and total apathy. This was a little girl who adored Princess Sophia cartoons and felt special in vibrant, colorful dresses. Her eyes were hazel green, a detail missed by the officer who lazily checked the blue box on the official intake form. He couldn't even be bothered to look her in the eye. Meanwhile, her grandmother fought like hell to pull her out of that abyss. Her efforts weren't enough. But the file on Kaye's case does not close with her last breath. The subsequent actions of Kruger and Warner peel back the mask on their true character. They didn't seek out the police. They didn't call for a medic or confess. Instead, they made a cold, tactical choice to conceal the evidence of what had occurred. They abandoned the unit without a word, packed their bags, and fled the scene, leaving the evidence behind them. These are the monsters the system trusted with a 3-year-old, failing to acknowledge every glaring red flag in the process. On February 1st, 2014, investigators finally breached the perimeter of the apartment. They processed a hollow scene where the guilty parties had already skipped town. 24 hours later, on February 2nd, Kruger and Warner were intercepted at a transit hub 60 minutes outside of Napa. They ran as if a state line could wash the blood off their hands. What you just heard is not a mere narrative, it is a warning. This is a grim lesson for our collective consciousness. Archive this footage and distribute it across your social networks. Visibility is a shield for the vulnerable. Connect with others in the discussion section who feel the weight of this investigative report. We are forging a network of watchers who refuse to stay silent. When the trial of Kruger and Warner opened, the eyes of the public were fixed on them. The gallery was standing room only, filled with citizens demanding a reckoning for the life of a 3-year-old girl. Prosecutors laid out a trail of evidence that rattled even the most hardened lawyers, including accounts of the violent domestic friction. They highlighted 14 ignored calls to 911 and the medical examiner's devastating timeline of the events that transpired. The legal system processed Kruger and Warner in separate courtrooms. Both suspects played the victim, pointing fingers at one another and spinning pathetic excuses for their situation. But the jury was not buying the theater. They scrutinized the hard data and the cold clinical reports. They heard grandmother Robin's gut-wrenching plea for the help that never came. No amount of legal maneuvering could overshadow the absolute truth. May 2017. The jury returned, delivering a crushing blow, guilty on every top-tier state charge. This wasn't a lapse. It wasn't heat of the moment. They saw through that facade. What remained was a calculated sequence of cruelty. Judge Francisco Tischer stepped up to finalize the reckoning. Life behind bars, no parole, the absolute limit. As the shackles clinked, Ryan Warner locked eyes with Jason Slusher. Kaye's father himself, an inmate brought in under heavy escort, listened as the murderer leaned in to speak. "Hope you find peace. I'm innocent." A lie that disintegrated against the forensic reality. But the investigation went deeper. In 2015, the Slushers launched a federal assault against Napa's City Hall, the precinct, and child welfare. The complaint stripped away anonymity. Officer Wade made the list for feeding deception to a desperate grandmother. Chambers and Smith stood accused of fatal blindness. Beside them, Diaz Lara, a social worker who choked the information flow. The federal judge's ruling was biting. He branded their actions as shockingly incompetent. January 2019. $5 million changed hands, a historic settlement born from a catastrophic systemic collapse. $5 million can't undo the past, but it sends a massive, undeniable message. Dropping the ball on a child's life now carries a steep premium. With the cash came forced institutional evolution. Today, Napa's finest are stripped of excuses. They must lay eyes on the child during every welfare intervention, not from a distance. No more peeking through door chains. Every adult inside must show their credentials. Period. Shift's end means reports are filed, no delays. Social services must now mirror their intel with the police instantly. Those bureaucratic silos that sheltered tragedy have been systematically dismantled to ensure no child slips through again. The new doctrine is live. Right now, an officer is refusing to walk away, demanding a visual on a child. There's a kid breathing safe air tonight, specifically because the machinery of the state finally found its soul. Those children won't ever hear her name, but their survival is the living legacy of Kaye Slusher's tragedy. Kaye was a fan of Princess Sophia. She spent her days imagining vibrant gowns and the safety of castles. Her eyes were hazel green, a detail missed by an officer who couldn't bother to look. 3 years, 8 months. Her short life has been codified into a grim curriculum for every new badge and social worker in training. Her name headlines the protocols shielding the vulnerable. Kaye couldn't save herself, but her shadow guards others daily. This specific file is going into the archives, but the vigilance required to protect children remains a constant operation. Ensure your alerts are active and stay informed. Review the other case briefings in the database. Pass this intelligence to those on the front lines. Act as the megaphone for those who can't even whisper. Somewhere, a clock is ticking for a kid waiting for a hero. You might be the only one watching. I appreciate you standing watch with us during this deep dive. Stay sharp out there.